Hello, my name is LoG, and today is going to be another gear overview video. Now, my pedals and my general tone's pretty much exactly the same as the previous video I did. However, how I am controlling everything is quite different. In fact, my current setup allows all of my pedals to switch on or off by themselves.
Oh yeah.
I decided to do this as my group Gallia Social is now out and playing live, and if you're not familiar with the band, which you can check out right here, just click this link, just click the link. There it is. The live set is fairly difficult to play and sing at the same time, so I wanted to at least automate my pedal switching so I didn't have to worry about it on stage, especially considering the entire set is already locked in to a click. Now, automating pedals is not something new. People have been doing it for quite a while. However, I did find it slightly difficult to figure out exactly the pieces of gear that I needed to do it and how the process would actually work. So I wanted to make this video going through step by step how I'm making it happen in case you're curious. There are multiple pieces of gear that can do this, but the star of the show today is going to be the Voodoo Lab Hex. Special thanks to my Sweetwater rep, shout out to Will, for pointing me towards this piece of gear as it turned out to be exactly what I needed. Before we go over the Hex and how it works, let's first look at my pedals and the order that I use them. From start to finish, it looks like this. Guitar, a Bluesman vintage sedan, into a Wampler Ego compressor, Horizon Nano Attack, a Wampler Tumnus, an exotic BB preamp, a J-Rocket The Dude overdrive, TC flashback delay, TC Hall of Fame reverb, a Strymon Blue Sky reverb, and then finally into a Fender DeVille. The Ego compressor, Tumnus, and the BB preamp make up my bass tone, which is an ever so slightly driven clean. These three pedals are on all of the time and are not being controlled by the Hex whatsoever. As far as the other 5 pedals go, the Nano Attack gives me a light boost, more drive, and a bit more bite to the tone. The Dude gives me full-on distortion, mostly used for big leads. The flashback is a basic delay that I have on most of the time. The Hall of Fame is a basic light reverb that I have on for some light ambience during certain moments. The Strymon Blue Sky is another reverb, but I have it set much heavier, almost to an overpowering point. I use this mostly for big ambient sections, especially sections that use harmonics. All 5 of these pedals are switching on or off throughout the set and are all being fully controlled by the Hex. Speaking of the Hex, let's go over how it works. When I first heard of people automating their pedals, because I don't really know anything, I assumed that those pedals were somehow being literally turned on or off using some electronic magic. Now, perhaps there are some pieces of gear that do this, but from what I can tell, the main way this automation is achieved isn't by turning the pedals on or off, it's by connecting them to an effects loop, which is then turned on or off. This is exactly how the Hex works, by using an effects loop, much like the ones you'll find in most most amps of today. If you don't know what an effects loop is, let me give you a very general rundown of what they are and why they exist. Here's the top of a Fender DeVille, pretty similar to the one that I use. When you plug into an amp, you can think of your signal as a moving vehicle traveling on a path through the various sections of the amp. In general, your signal will go into the input jack, which is called going into the front of the amp. Then it will hit the preamp section. This is where the majority of the amp's tone lives. You'll usually have a gain knob, EQ, various channels with different levels of gain, of volume, etc. After you travel through this section, you will then hit the power amp, which powers the speakers that your tone will come out of and can slightly color the tone even further. This section usually has a master volume and maybe a few other things. After this, your signal then hits the speakers and comes out as guitar tone. However, certain amps like this one allow the signal to take a detour in between the preamp and power amp sections. This detour, located right here, allows the signal to come out of the amp after the preamp section into something else like a pedal or multiple pedals, and then back into the amp to finish the path into the power amp and then out of the speakers. This detour is most commonly used to add in effects like delay or reverb after your general guitar tone has already been shaped or colored by the preamp section, hence the term effects loop. You might be wondering, why should I use the effects loop? Can't I just run into the front of the amp with everything and play like normal? For tone shaping pedals like overdrives, boosts, distortions, etc., going into the front of the amp is often the choice, as those pedals are made to travel through the preamp section of the amp to further shape your tone. Effect pedals like reverb and delay can do the same thing with no issue, but if you're using distortion from the amp, you will run into problems. For example, if you have guitar into a reverb, a delay, and then into the front of a heavily distorted amp, you'll notice your delay and reverb being way louder and almost uncontrollable, even if they're set low on the actual pedal. This is because the reverb and delay is now baked into your guitar signal, which is then being distorted by the amp, and because distortion naturally boosts and compresses your signal, the baked-in reverb and delay will also be boosted and compressed. However, if you put your reverb and delay after the distortion of your amp through the effects loop, the reverb and delay will not be boosted or compressed by the natural distortion of your amp because those pedals are being introduced into the signal afterwards, giving you a much cleaner sound that is more representative of what you have them set to on the actual pedal. To activate the effects loop on an amp like this one, you simply have to plug cables into the effects loop jacks. If there are no cables plugged into those jacks, the signal will simply bypass the effects loop as though it's not there. However, some other amps have manual controls to turn the effects loop on or off regardless of if there are cables in the jacks. This is usually done with a switch or button nearby the effects loop or with a foot switch. This manual control of the effects loop is exactly how the Voodoo Lab Hex works, the only difference being the Hex has 6 effects loops that are all MIDI controllable, meaning if you have a MIDI floorboard at your feet, you can switch your pedals using that instead of on the physical pedal, or you control everything automatically through a laptop, which is what I'm doing. Let's first take a look at the front of the Hex. You'll notice 6 numbers which are associated with the 6 effects loops. Each effects loop has its own little light telling you when they're activated or not. These lights are also switches where you can manually turn them on or off regardless of MIDI input. Let's now take a look at the back where all the magic happens. The first thing you'll notice is a whole bunch of jacks, which makes sense as you have the option to send the signal out into a pedal and then back in 6 times. But there's something else to this pedal that makes it even more convenient. Let's take a look at loop 1 located right here. You'll notice 4 jacks, 1 for the general input of the guitar signal, 2 for the effects loop which goes out into the pedal and then back into the Hex, and then 1 more for the general output of the guitar signal to travel wherever. This is what a fully independent loop looks like. General signal in, effects loop out and then back in, and then general signal out. This means for each effects loop, you have 4 jacks, which also means 4 cables. If you take a look at this piece of gear, the Voodoo Lab GCX, you'll notice it has 8 fully independent effects loops, with each one having 4 jacks, like I just mentioned. However, if we look back at the Hex, there seems like there should be more jacks if we have 6 loops. And this is where the design of the Hex makes things a bit more convenient. Loop 1 is fully independent with 4 jacks, like I just mentioned, but loops 2 through 6 are all internally routed together, which means loops 2 through 6 all share the same general in and out jacks. So what you'll see here is 1 jack for the general signal in, 2 jacks each for effects loop 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then 1 more output for the general signal to travel to the next destination, which is usually your amp. This allows the Hex to be much smaller in form and, most importantly, saves you money on cabling. For some players that have very complex pedal boards that need fully independent loops, this might not be ideal. However, the vast majority of players that have simple pedal setups like I do, having every single loop being fully independent really isn't necessary. Let me show you what I mean. This is exactly how everything is running in my rig. Guitar into the Wampler compressor, into the first general input of the Hex, then out of effects loop 1 into the Nano Attack and back, which then travels through the next general output into the Tumnus, which is then normally connected to the BB. You'll notice while everything looks like it's connected to the Hex, the only pedal that's actually being controlled by an effects loop is the Nano Attack. The compression, Tumnus, and BB preamp are not moving through any loops whatsoever. They're simply hanging out by themselves on the general signal path, which, if you remember, is exactly what I wanted. These pedals are on all of the time, and I don't need them to be adjustable. Afterwards, the signal connects to the general input of loops 2 through 6, which is where the rest of the pedals are being looped and controlled. Loop 2 is the dude overdrive, loop 3 is the delay, loop 4 is the light reverb, loop 5 is the heavy reverb, and then loop 6 is nothing for now. After all of that, the signal travels through the general output of this batch of loops into the final destination, the front of my DeVille. You might be saying, wait a minute, I thought you weren't supposed to put effects like delay or reverb into the front of the amp. This is true only if you're using amp distortion, which I am not. All of my distortion is coming from pedals, and my amp is always set to the bass clean stage, so my effects won't be automatically boosted or compressed from amp distortion. This setup allows me to control the pedals that I want controlled, but also gives me room to have pedals outside of the Hex within the signal path that are just simply on all of the time. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if your pedal setup is very complex, like you have a bunch of pedals randomly throughout your signal path that you don't want connected to a loop, this piece might not be the one you're looking for. You might want to find something with more independent loops. However, also like I mentioned earlier, for most people, the Hex is going to do exactly what you need. One more very important thing, remember, the Hex is not turning your physical pedal on or off. It is turning the effects loop that the pedal is connected to on or off. This means that if you want your pedal controlled, the pedal needs to be in the on position, meaning the switch is on all of the time. Because remember, the Hex is simply choosing when to include that pedal's signal, so the pedal needs to be on all of the time, ready to go. Now that we know how everything works, let's get to automating. To get your pedals switching automatically, you have to use something that can send MIDI. The vast majority of the time, this will be some sort of recording software or digital audio workstation in a laptop. Pretty much every modern recording software will have no problem with this task. For this setup, I personally run Ableton on a MacBook, but again, any laptop that can run any modern software will probably be fine. The other thing that you'll need is a middleman to connect the Hex to your laptop, as the majority of laptops do not have built-in MIDI connectors. This middleman will be an audio interface that is MIDI capable, again, extremely common. Personally, I use a Focusrite Scarlett 6i6. You will connect the audio interface into the laptop via USB, and then the audio interface into the Hex via MIDI. Make sure your interface recognizes the MIDI connection if you need to, and you're ready to program. Now that everything is hooked up and ready to go, we can start programming our pedals to switch automatically using MIDI. There are probably multiple ways to use MIDI to control the Hex, but the way that I'm using it is through track automation. If you're not familiar with what automation is, let me demonstrate. On your screen, you'll see an open project file in Cubase, and right in the middle, you'll see a big chord being played by strings. Let's listen to what it sounds like. Sounds good, but I want the volume to slowly increase and decrease throughout the length of this chord. This is where track automation comes into play. The track directly below the strings, right here, is an automation track. This track allows me to automatically control nearly everything associated with the synth track above. Right now I'm controlling the volume, which you can see here, but I can also control a variety of other things like panning or even individual values of the EQ for this track. To adjust the volume like I mentioned before, I simply turn on the automation by hitting this button. With the track active, I can now plot points along this line and create what essentially looks like a line graph. As the line goes up, the volume goes up. As the line goes down, the volume goes down. Let's hear what this sounds like now with the automation. You'll also be able to see the value of the volume increasing or decreasing right here. Let's say I don't want the volume to change gradually. I want it to be a drastic, immediate change. You can simply do this by plotting a point that makes the line do a sharp 90-degree turn, like this. With this type of automation, we should hear the track go from normal volume to complete silence and then back to normal volume. This drastic increase or decrease in volume is happening because the automation is telling the values to change immediately. You can plot as many points as you want, moving in any direction that you want to create whatever sort of complex automation your brain can come up with. Let's now take a look at how I'm using an automation track like this one to turn the pedals on or off in Ableton. Here's the project file for the Gallia Social live show. You'll notice the normal things like backing tracks, backing vocals, bass, and a click track. However, below that, you'll notice some more tracks labeled for each pedal. If I open one, you'll see an automation track below with a line graph with various points plotted exactly like what I just showed you in Cubase. Except with this track, I'm not controlling volume, I'm controlling when the pedal should be on or off. The process is very simple. In general, when working with MIDI automation, you can set the plot points on your line graph anywhere from a value of 0 to a value of 127. This, of course, is perfect for things like volume, as there are many different levels of volume an audio file can have. However, for the Hex, there are only 2 possible states that a loop can be in, on or off. So very simply, if I want the pedal off, I put my line graph to 0, and if I want the pedal on, I put it all the way up to 127. You don't technically have to hit the extremes like this, as any value in the first half will be off, and any value in the second half will be on. I personally use the extremes, 0 for off and 127 for on, just because it's visually easier to see. If you're curious, this is exactly how I have my light show configured as well. If I open this track, you'll see multiple automation tracks controlling various elements of the lights by plotting points on a line graph exactly how I've done everything else so far. As we move down to the pedals, you'll notice I have individual automation tracks for each one that I want to control. You'll see this track is for the nano attack, this track is for the dude, this track is for the delay, the light reverb, and then the heavy Strymon reverb. To connect these individual tracks to the corresponding hex loops, you simply have to make sure you're using matching MIDI channels, which you can see listed right here. According to the manual, the hex uses MIDI channels 80 to 85 for loops 1 to 6 by default. So loop 1, the nano attack, is channel 80. Loop 2, the dude, is channel 81. Loop 3, the delay, is channel 82, so on and so forth. You can of course change these within the hex if you so desire. Here it is in action. You'll notice the top of the screen is the Ableton project, and the bottom of the screen is the front of the hex that is in my live rig. Right now, the automation that you're seeing in Ableton is the automation for the Strymon Heavy Reverb, which is locked into loop 5 on the hex. The moment the progress bar hits the MIDI value of 127, you'll notice the light will turn on, activating the loop and the connected pedal. Once the progress bar hits the next change in MIDI down to a value of 0, the loop and connected pedal will turn off. Let me show you that same thing, but with me playing during those changes. One last thing that I noticed about this process, make sure that if you're plotting your line graph, the on and off values are immediate and consistent. So if you want your pedal on, make sure you plot an immediate jump to that on value and make sure the entire line of the on section is set to the same value, like 127 from start to finish. If the beginning of the line is 127, but the end of the line is 123, Ableton will constantly send out MIDI signal to the hex as the MIDI value is slowly changing over time. This won't affect the on or off status of your pedal, but you might hear some subtle electrical noise or even subtle cutting of your signal. I made this mistake multiple times and it took me a lot longer than I'd like to admit to figure out what was happening. Now that we know how the laptop is using MIDI to communicate with the hex, we have all of the information we need to finally automate our pedals. With that in mind, let's take a look at how I have everything set up in my actual rig in what I call the box. This is an 8-spaced rack unit that houses pretty much everything I need for my live show, including the audio interface, the lighting interface, the hex, all of my pedals, cables, and associated power, as well as any cables that I need to connect to the house sound. If we open it up on this side, you'll notice the audio and lighting interface, the power unit which supplies power to everything in the box, and some pedals, in particular the Wampler compression, which is where the guitar goes in to begin the signal path. You'll also notice 2 USB cables right here, which is how I connect both the lighting and the audio interface to the laptop. If we open the other side, you'll get a better view of how everything is connected. You'll first see the hex below with all of the cabling traveling to the pedals in the way that I described earlier. You'll also see a MIDI cable coming out of the hex into the audio interface to communicate with Ableton. At the end of the hex, you'll see this 1/4 inch cable which sends the signal into the final destination, my Fender DeVille. On top, you'll notice the power unit supplying power to anything that needs it, which for me is 2 separate pedal powering units and my audio interface. Side note, the hex can be fully powered like a pedal using a standard pedal powering unit, like the Voodoo Lab Pedal Power 2 Plus right here, as long as you have an open and compatible slot. Besides the pedals, you'll also see some line cables coming out of the interface. This is for the stereo backing tracks, the bass track, and the click track. Again, all coming out of the laptop. You'll also see this jack here, which is where I will eventually connect my lighting setup to this DMXIS light interface. If you want to do something like this and build a rig like the one here, I highly recommend that you get custom length cables. Shout out to a friend of mine, Ryan Johnson, who made all of these for me. It simply makes things much easier to put together and keeps things much cleaner inside. You'll also notice some of the pedals are positioned upside down on some of the rack shelves. I did this as it helps save space, keeps things from getting too cluttered, and I thought it was kind of funny. I also have all of the longer cables like the main power cable, the line cables for the house sound system and the click track, and the cable going to my DeVille attached to a nearby panel. So all I need to do is open the panel and everything is organized, ready to go. Of course, liberal use of twisty ties, zip ties, Velcro ties, and adhesive cable fasteners is also recommended. Although it did take me some time to figure out all of the exact components that I needed and how to position everything in the box to be as efficient as possible, like where the interfaces are going to go, where the pedals are going to go, how they're going to connect to the hex, etc. Once everything was locked in place, it works pretty much perfectly and I don't really have to think about it at all. Speaking of the hex, if you are using a digital amp for all of your pedal effect needs, you won't have to buy a separate MIDI controller like the hex, because most digital amps of today, like an Axe Effects for example, have MIDI capability built in. So all you need to do is automate your pedals in your laptop like I just showed you, connect your laptop directly to your digital amp, make sure everything is communicating properly, and you should be good to go. That pretty much does it. Hopefully all this stuff makes sense. Even if you're not planning on automating all of your pedals like I showed you today, I still think understanding this process is very valuable in case it is something you want to try down the road or someone you know wants to do it. You'll now have the information to do it properly. Hopefully you enjoy this video. See you in the next one.